When thousands of girls turned up for abortions, for contraceptives, for treatment of sexually transmitted diseases and infections, one would have thought that that might trigger an alarm. I think taking a step back, we can see how a culture which has for so long empowered teenage girls and seen it as a source of freedom for teenagers to be having sex, has suddenly missed all these obvious signs of abuse.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of About Abortion. I'm delighted to be joined today by a very special guest, Lois McLatchie Miller. Have I got that surname correct?
Yeah, it's such a mouthful, isn't it?
I think you might be the first double-barreled person I've had on the show, so this is a real honour.
McLatchie's just a middle name. I'm a Miller, really.
Oh, is it Miller? Okay, right, fine. Well, look, thanks so much, Lois, for coming on. It's great to have you. Just love to let our listeners get to know you a little bit before we dive in. Tell us what you're up to these days. What's your work? What does a day in the life of Lois look like, or a week in the life?
Sure. Well, I get to work for an organization called ADF International, which is a group that champions the right of everybody to live and speak the truth, whether that's Christians who are silenced or arrested even for praying silently on the streets of the UK, or Christians or anyone who gets into trouble for tweeting biological facts about life or gender or life in the womb. And so, yeah, I get to work in these interesting cases, but I also spend a bit of time doing commentary and speaking out in the press and the media about issues affecting Britons, especially the most vulnerable, those in the womb.
Brilliant. And speaking of tweeting biological facts, you do a lot of that yourself. Doing a great job on Twitter, shining the light. So those listening, do go and follow Lois on Twitter, shining the light, not only on the issue that we're particularly looking at today, but as you said, Lois, across the board on issues of human dignity, freedom of speech, and so on. So yeah, bless you in the work you're doing. And Lois, you're a Christian. Can you tell us a bit about how and when you came to be in Christ?
Sure. I turned away from a life of sin at 5 years old.
Praise
I
God.
had the I had the benefit and privilege of growing up in a Christian family, but probably made it my own when I was kind of at university and kind of had to consider all these matters and what it meant personally to follow Christ in a different environment. So I've been very grateful for that. And yeah, I've enjoyed using my career to be able to work on these matters and to serve Christ. So, amen.
Wonderful. That's great stuff. Well, I want to come back to that a little bit at the end, if that's okay. But let's dive straight into the subject matter for today. We're talking today about this horrific scandal of grooming gangs in the north of England,
Yeah.
and in particular the relationship between that and secret abortions, secret state-funded abortions. And when we say secret, we mean kept a secret from the parents of these underage girls who've been so hideously abused. So first of all, can you just bring us up to speed? I'm sure most of our listeners will be aware of what's been going on to some degree, but just bring us up to speed. What's been going on? What do we actually know about these grooming gangs? What speculation? What do we actually? I know 7 men were sentenced, weren't they, back in September? But I've seen reports that there may be as many as 1,400 victims. It was just 2 victims in that case. What do we know? What's the picture? And what do we still not know and sort of needs to be found out?
I think this has been such a shocking scandal just because of the ever expanding scale of what we're finding out. So, what we know is that across the last 3 decades, and even to this day, little working class girls have been made victims of what's called grooming gangs. They have been abducted, they've been subject to horrific rapes, gang rapes. They've been groomed and sold by pimps, and many have even been brutally murdered. It really is of that degree of seriousness. It's shocking to say. It feels almost as if you shouldn't be speaking these words, but you have to be speaking about what is true and what has happened. There's lots of different kind of political and social takes on this issue, and of course, it is true that many of the perpetrators were from immigrant communities, many from predominantly Pakistan, although other parts of the world, and many of the Muslim faith. And so a large portion of the debate has been about immigration, looking at were and many of the investigations that have taken place at local levels have found that police and authorities were reluctant to prosecute, to follow every lead for justice, because they feared being called racist. They feared being called Islamophobic, and so they didn't take the side of the little girls who were victims, but instead just tried to sweep it under the carpet. And that's certainly horror, and it shows us the depth of harm that censorship can cause, the depth of harm of refusing to talk about issues. But I think that more than one thing can be true at the same time. Whilst that was certainly a factor, there's also some factors that we have to look at ourselves about at home in Britain. What structures, what authorities, what institutions failed outside of immigration discourse? How did we let down the little girls who needed us in our country?
Thank you, Lois, for bringing us up to speed on that. Now, there are calls, aren't there, for a bigger national inquiry. There have been a number of local inquiries. At this point, in your view, does it look like that's going to happen? And why is there such resistance, particularly on the part of the Labour government, it seems, to a national inquiry?
It's been a strange one, hasn't it? Because you would think that a government, when coming face to face with this scandal, would automatically say, yes, of course, let's have a national inquiry. Now, it became a little bit of a political football. The Labour government said that there already had been inquiries take place at a local level, and so that there was a need for a national inquiry. And the criticism of that has been that a local inquiry just has lesser powers to investigate, has lesser ability to really go into the depth of things. They're not able to kind of call people for testimony. It's all very much done on a voluntary basis. And secondly, if you have a local inquiry, even to the best of their ability, they will not have a national picture of how great the scale of this was. And I think we do need to have that overview. Now, on the other side, the Tories have been using it as a bit of a political football of their own. They tried to push it into a bill that they knew that Labour particularly wanted to pass. It did become a little bit of a political point scoring goal. And obviously, we know that the Tories, too, who were in power for the last 14 years, also did not act to the extent of their powers to stop this kind of from taking place. So I think whilst everybody kind of wants to use it as a way to show how great their party is, I think everybody has to absorb a bit of the blame for the oversight that has taken place. But there still remains this debate over a national inquiry. I think yesterday there was some concessions made that there could be grounds for a national inquiry, and that is good. But I think it's quite obvious to everybody that that would be just step one of what needs to happen. And an inquiry will mean nothing if there is not arrests, if there is not prosecutions for those who were involved in these horrific crimes, and if things don't fundamentally change to take care of the girls who were affected.
Well, that's right. There needs to be a fundamental change of heart, really, doesn't there? People need to change their attitude and their priorities. And we can do structural things, but unless there's real heart change, again, we'll come on to that a bit later. I want to look a bit deeper at the ideologies behind all this stuff. But certainly, if a national inquiry is warranted, my view is, who cares if it's a political football or not? If it's the right thing to do, let's get it done. And in comparison, who cares if people are using it for political reasons? If this is what the girls need for protection, then that's what we ought to do. But can you tell us then about something that's we already knew about this? I think we may even have talked about this before. But this has highlighted, amongst other things, the phenomenon of abortions granted to underage girls without the knowledge or consent of their parents. Can you tell us a little bit about what we know, and not just in this case, but is this happening elsewhere? And what part does that play in actually covering for the abusers, and as a piece in the puzzle of this whole scandal? Where does it belong? How significant is it?
Well, I think here's a good starting place. When thousands of little girls in places like Oldham and Rotherham and the up to 50 poverty-stricken towns that were affected, when thousands of girls turned up for abortions, for contraceptives, for treatment of sexually transmitted diseases and infections, one would have thought that that might trigger an alarm. One might have thought the abortion providers, those who worked at sexual and reproductive health clinics, would say, hang on, why is there suddenly a spike of 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds coming in for these things? Why are they engaging in this activity? Could something be going wrong? And it's quite baffling that was not a point of issue raised. And I think taking a step back, we can see how a culture which has for so long empowered teenage girls and seen it as a source of freedom for teenagers to be having sex, has suddenly missed all these obvious signs of abuse. If we look back then through the last few decades, we can see how this process happened on a step-by-step basis. Back in 1985, there was a case in court where a Catholic mother called Victoria Gillick took a case to court arguing that she should know if her teenage daughters are getting contraceptives from a clinic. She lost that case. And as a result, new guidelines were drawn up in the public service, in the public sector, to say that a child, let's say, because it is a child under the age of 16, a child's right to confidentiality trumps a parent's right to parent. And that it kind of introduced this attitude of, well, teens will be teens, but as long as there's no pregnancies that result, that's okay. The drive is really on reducing teen pregnancy. And I think if you think about that period going into the 90s and the 2000s, that was kind of the big issue of the day, was reducing teen pregnancies. And the solution was seen as confidentiality and allowing children to have a kind of non-judgmental help from the state to get contraceptives to avoid them being in that situation. But of course, the state did not think that perhaps it would be much, much better to reduce teen sexual activity. Maybe they were too young to be parents and therefore too young to be engaging in sex. A later court case in the mid-2000s represented a mother who wanted to know if her daughters were being given abortions without her knowledge. And she lost that case as well, which was another kind of landmark point in this journey. So now we have that not only can teenagers gain access to contraceptives, but also abortions with nobody knowing. And this kind of set the background. And then, as we know, if anyone who's been following kind of abortion politics of the last few years, really the wheels have come off in terms of safeguarding on this background. In COVID, we introduced measures like pills by post, which means that any woman can call up, claim that she's over 60 and claim that she's under 10 weeks pregnant and receive a pill in the mail to take on her own. Nobody's having an insight examination to check if this woman really is only under 10 weeks, putting her in grave danger just from a medical perspective if she is much further developed in her pregnancy. And of course, who's to know if a little 13-year-old is pretending to be 16, sitting there with her abuser boyfriend on the other end of the line, making sure that the evidence of his abuse is taken care of and gotten rid of. And so I think there's two outcomes that we should take in order to protect little girls from this perspective going forward. I think there's two big lessons we can learn here from this scandal. One is that we have to take the age of consent seriously. Now, in this country, it's 16 years old. I think that's actually too young to be giving consent. I don't think a 16-year-old can recognize a groomer. But if we are saying that the age of consent is 16 years old, then why are we turning a blind eye to 14-year-olds turning up at abortion clinics? We need to take it seriously. And if this is happening, then parents need to be informed, authorities need to be informed for the safety of the younger girls. And secondly, I think we have to rethink these policies that have been so lax over the years, like pills by post, and ensure that abuse safeguarding is taken seriously as it is in place, and that people are monitoring who is receiving abortion pills and if they are in fact victims of one of these grooming gangs. I think these are just obvious next steps. And if we don't have ideological lenses on, then I think everybody would agree that this is just basic safety.
So you mentioned Gillick there. Am I right in thinking there is something now referred to as the Gillick principle or something, which suggests an under 16-year-old who's deemed to be especially mature can give consent, whereas they usually wouldn't be allowed? Is that the saying Gillick?
Yeah, so Gillick is about consent regarding under 16s.
Yeah.
And it again goes back to this kind of strange idea that a 16-year-old. Now, it was set at 16, I believe, because at the time you were allowed to get married at 16. And so, of course, you're going to put this age of the consent at the same time, or else you'd end up in a very funny situation. But actually, last year, the government made new legislation which raised the national marriage age to 18 years old. And so, for the first time, we actually have a situation in our country where we have decoupled in law sex from marriage.
Mm.
We have set a standard, put out a message that for 16-year-olds, it's fine to have sex, but they aren't ready to get married. And we know that you should really only be consenting to sex if you're able to consent to pregnancy. If you're in a situation where, because every time that happens, a pregnancy is possible, a pregnancy may result. And so to decouple sex from marriage really puts out an odd message, a message that says that sex doesn't really matter, that any resulting pregnancies can be taken care of. And it just really diminishes and demeans what these concepts mean. So I, having thought about it for the last few days, and I'm open to, I think this is, I understand there's different opinions on this, but I do think we should be raising the age of consent to 18, back in line with the marriage age, um, for the sake of the principle, but also for the sake of protection. I think in a society where very, very few people are really getting married under the age of 18, I think we can agree that these children are vulnerable. These children are vulnerable to being groomed, to believing somebody is their boyfriend when really they mean them harm. And therefore, it's time, I think, to make the age of consent 18.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with you on that because you mentioned the importance of keeping those things together, sex and marriage, but also the cognitive dissonance whereby the government or our laws are basically saying you can't get married till you're 18 because you're too immature and you can't meaningfully give consent. But you can give consent essentially to being groomed a
Yeah.
couple of years earlier. And in fact, even before that, in practical terms, you can give consent to having an abortion. But then doesn't that imply you were also old enough to have sex before you were 16? Because if you can have an abortion without consent or knowledge of your parents, you're communicating uh, that this child, this 15-year-old, is mature enough under this Gillick principle to make their own decisions. And yet, by definition, they have recently either been abused and hideously raped, or they have, in their minds, given consent to something which, if I'm not mistaken, is actually a crime, isn't it? To have sex below 16 is an offence of some degree.
It should be, but it just has not been treated like that for a long, long
Right.
time. And it hasn't triggered. I mean, it should be just an automatic if somebody has, come into a clinic because of that. It should be an automatic trigger on safeguarding concerns, but it hasn't. It isn't, and it's because of this attitude of teens will be teens. We'll
Mm.
just keep them safe.
Mm.
With safety just meaning keep them safe from a pregnancy or maybe safe from a disease. Um, yeah, no, it's a complete societal failure. It's a cultural failure and a social failure,
Mm.
and that's why I think it's really important to take the grooming gangs conversation beyond just the debate about
Yeah.
immigration, which is valid, and it's got to be, these things have to be discussed, but we have to. It's kind of becoming, the talking point of the right is, oh, this is about immigration, but the right have things to learn as well, about the culture that we allowed to fester in our own country, and yeah, I think lessons have to be learned.
Yeah, I'd love to move on to that now, if we may. Actually, I think to me, immigration is a bit of a broad term, perhaps not as precise as we need to be in getting to the root of this and related things. It seems to me, I don't know what your perspective is. There's been a reluctance, even by those who say they're being very forthright and calling out, and uh, and not being pigeonholed as far right or bigots or whatever. Even amongst those people, I think there can be a reluctance to really get to the roots of what's going on ideologically. There's a relationship, of course, between ideology and culture. What we believe affects what we do, and that's true of individuals. It's true of entire societies. Now, obviously, we've got a bit of a mishmash, haven't we, in our nation at the moment of different ideologies and cultures, and this kind of melting pot. I think in this scandal we actually see a really important example of at least two distinct cultures clashing, and actually it's been quite an unholy mixture because these girls in particular have lost out. But I think there are dangers and failings in at least two ideologies I'd love to explore a bit more with you. So firstly, we've touched on this a bit, but our sort of Western ideology, talk to us a little bit about notions of feminism or so-called sexual freedom or autonomy. How has this resulted in the kind of sex culture and abortion culture where actually these underage girls are left vulnerable to this kind of attack, and on top of that, they're even so easily overlooked and not given justice for
Yeah.
so long?
Yeah, and I apologize if this is going to get a bit graphic for the listeners, but on the same week that we're just sitting here discussing the gang rapes of little girls, little white working class girls, there's also been a story circulating about a porn star called Bonnie Blue, who proudly showed the internet that she had allegedly slept with 1,000 men in 12 hours. I think the juxtaposition of, I mean, what kind of message are we putting out? How are we portraying white British women? How are we really defending
Mm.
ourselves if we're saying that this is empowering and this is feminism and this is helpful? I mean, I just couldn't believe the lack of sensitivity that a porn star had to sharing this information this week and to bragging and boasting about having this experience with 1,000 men. And it just leads to it's this hypocrisy in our culture, isn't it? It just doesn't make any sense. We're saying that that sleeping around is empowering and it's a win of feminism and a win of the sexual revolution, but ultimately it's not. Since the sexual revolution took place, that kind of historical moment in the 60s where our conception of what sex was changed and it became kind of emancipatory thing for women to be able to sleep around and not have any kind of commitments. Since then, according to a Yale study, women's overall happiness has decreased in absolute and relative terms to men. And if you look around at our culture today, never has a culture been more sexually free, and never has a culture had such high rates of loneliness, depression, anxiety, people living alone, abortion, of course, suicide rates. I mean, we're not a healthy society. Or something
Mm.
has gone deeply, deeply wrong, and it's it's beyond time to take a step back and see what are the cultural principles that have shifted, and has this freedom, so-called freedom, really been something that's healthy and good for human flourishing, as we have eliminated that bond between sex and marriage, and the marriage rate has plummeted. Are people happier, or
Mm.
are we looking for something a bit deeper?
Mm. Mm. Yeah, thank you. I think it was my friend Ben John who used to work at Christian Concern. He said two people consenting to something doesn't make it right, and yet we've kind of almost made a religion out of what I want, haven't we? If I want it and you want it, it's
Mhm.
okay. And
Right.
yet clearly that doesn't hold water. The sorts of values or devaluation that promotes, I think we, as you say, we're seeing that the fruit of that not only in this scandal, and just how lightly rape is often taken across the board actually in our nation in terms of penalties, but also the degradation of the sort of OnlyFans phenomenon as well. So I think, yeah, I think our Western culture certainly has a part to play in this. And I don't know if you saw the Seth Gruber documentary on abortion, but I think it was there he said abortion is the linchpin of all this. Without abortion, you
Mhm.
couldn't have the so-called sexual revolution, because it's one of the key. Anne Frady talks about it as part of the birth control package. You need contraceptives, you need abortion, you need both, and that's what facilitates not only sexual revolution, but of course also this abuse. They depended on
Yeah.
abortions,
Yeah.
secret abortions, didn't they, to get away with what they did.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that,
That's right.
sorry, do jump in there if there was something you wanted to say there.
No, no, please go.
So the other ideology, well, maybe two more I'd like to look at, um, is Islamic ideology. So there are probably limits on how far we can go into this, but I'm still, I don't know your perspective. I don't think people are going into this enough. I think that there is a fear still, even those who are trying to call out the fear, even amongst those, there can be a fear of actually getting to the bottom of this. Um, it seems, correct me if I'm wrong, almost without variation, all these men are Muslim in terms of religion, in terms of their communities. Um, Islam is an ideology that generates a culture. Now, of course, not all Muslims would be what we call radical or even orthodox by their own terms, or faithful to the Quran. Many are much more liberal. There's a huge spectrum in terms of application. And yet, when we look at Islam itself, what sorts of attitudes towards women and girls do you think might uh, have an important part to play in this discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not going to pretend to be an expert in Islam because I'm not. So I defer to those who are much wiser than me in it. From my perspective, as a kind of layman looking at this, I think you're right when you talk about a spectrum. Um, because we do have a large spectrum of people who practice the Muslim faith in the UK. You know, you think of some examples where in Manchester, I think it was, where Muslim parents came out strongly to protect their children from gender ideology being taught to them in schools, and had a strong level of protection over their daughters when it came to that kind of thing. So we see that end of the spectrum. But on the other side, I was listening to Ayan Hirsi Ali speaking on a Barry Weiss's podcast the other day, who talked about in a more radical strains of Islam how a war with the West is kind of seen as giving permission to enact horrors upon the little girls that are here, as a kind of as they're kind of seen as infidels of these kind of cultural wars they're being kind of taken over by. So there seems to be a large range, is what I believe. And but yeah, whilst I'm not an expert, I do think we need to look into these things and discuss them more, and have experts like Ayan Hirsi give their explanations and their opinions, so that we can understand this a bit better. And I know there's great minds and great voices who've spoken out at things like Hyde Corner, speaking about Christianity and Islam, and how the religions compare, and how Christianity can point to truth about a God that reaches down to us, can point to truth about a God that values every single human being, from the most vulnerable, and how that can compare to all other religions held in the UK. What concerns me is seeing these conversations shut down. I know at ADF International, we're working on a case within the last few months where a street preacher, Dia Moodley, was arrested on the streets of Birmingham Bristol, after
Yep.
making comments about the differences between Christianity and Islam. And if we're going to have arrests whilst we're speaking on these conversations, we will never get anywhere. In fact, I think it will just dangerously fan resentment on both sides, which is not good for anyone. And so I think that the answer is to have more open conversations, respectful conversations, trying to gain a better understanding of what's going on what ideologies are allowing and where they're being misused. And that's my take on the situation as
Mm.
a layman.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I agree with you about a need for better conversation. I think that conversation needs to have a courage and an honesty to it. There seems to me in the media and in politics this almost a dogma that Islam has nothing to do with the behavior of Muslims ever. You know, it's like we've just decided to believe that the ideology itself, in its purest form, is peaceful, is good, is beneficial, and anyone who does anything bad in the name of Islam is a defector and has been radicalized. Well, by what? Surely by an ideology. Okay, so ideologies can be bad. What says that Islam can't be a bad ideology? I think one thing I haven't seen anyone mention this. Maybe that's because I don't read much, but it is well known that Muhammad himself married a young child, consummated marriage when she was about 10. Now, let's call it what it is. That's paedophilia. It's abuse. That's not consent. That's not real marriage. You can't marry a 10-year-old. Um, how different is that from the crimes we're seeing perpetrated today? I think we've got to at least have the conversation. Is there a connection between this ideology, which actually does give cover if faithfully followed, the example of the founder of the religion, and what's taking place? And it seems to me in the reports, um, the somewhat brave will at least name them as Pakistani, but people won't generally name them as Muslim because they're still afraid of that charge of Islamophobia. I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong. Perhaps you've seen people engaging on the issue of Islam itself as an ideology, but I haven't seen much of that yet.
And that was what hamstrung a lot of the initial investigation, wasn't it? There was a big fear, and this is recorded in many of the local inquiries, that there was a fear of being called Islamophobic. Um, So I think, it has been detrimental to catching perpetrators, and it's also put those who would identify as Muslim but aren't perpetrating those crimes in an extremely difficult spot now. I think it's caused much more harm for those communities who for who many of whom would have liked to see the perpetrators arrested and dealt with, but now it has cast aspersions on anyone who identifies as Pakistani or a Muslim. And so this probably is the worst of all worlds. And it was because of that chill on free speech, that chill on that fear of being called out or judged just for pursuing a line of inquiry that's led us to this situation. And I think that's yet another huge lesson we have to learn from this scandal.
Mm. Yeah, you touched on something there. I think that's really key, which is that whether we call it political correctness or whatever we call it, there is that desire not to be seen, to hold views, or to make accusations that are deemed bigoted or racist. That fear of being slandered as far right.
Mm.
How much do you think that fear is actually has a lot to answer for in this scandal? But also, do you, and feel free to say this is kind of not where you want to focus the conversation, because I want to hear from you today, but do you see that same fear wreaking havoc in the church? Our political correctness, not wanting to be seen as far right, don't want to be like a MAGA Christian, with issues like abortion but also gender and so on. How much does that fear of being slandered, labeled as far right, how much does that fear um, get in the way of being those voices for the voiceless that we're called to be?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're kind of warned throughout the Bible, aren't we, for as Christians, that when we will be slandered, we will be accused of horrendous things as we try and carry out the kingdom's work. So it's really nothing to be surprised about when we are defending the most vulnerable, that we will face intense criticism from those around us who love the ways of evil and not good. And unfortunately, yeah, I think we can all see many instances where church leadership has cowed to the fear of the world rather than stood up for truth. It's very easy to talk about important issues like welcoming the stranger and protecting the environment. All well and good in their own place, but incredibly easy to do. But it's difficult sometimes to talk about things that are more controversial, about the fact that no child has ever been born in the wrong body, and that no child can consent to toxic puberty blockers, which can damage their life forever. And yet, for many years, fortunately not so much anymore, but for many years, major churches stood silent as children became the victims of this ideology. We have the highest rate of abortion we've ever had in our country, 250,000 is it a year? You'll know the statistics, Dave. The greatest loss of life of a single group, a single minority singled out simply because they're weak and unwanted. And yet it is very difficult to engage those who have a standing for Christianity in the wider society to take on this horrific issue. Yeah, we do have hope because I always like to think back to, and maybe it's a cliche, but I like to think back to Wilberforce and the fact that when he was starting out his career, slavery was such a big institution of the day. Few people wanted to speak out against it. Most people were profiting from it, and nobody wanted to challenge it. And over the course of his lifetime, slowly, he was able to chip away to the extent that at the end of his life, he was able to organize a parliamentary vote to ban slavery, which led basically to the decriminalization of slavery around the world in slow time. So I think just because an issue seems like the church won't touch it at one point doesn't mean there isn't a hope that it never will. I think constantly bearing witness, spelling out the arguments, the facts, bringing light to the truth can play a huge role.
100%, and we are seeing it's small, it's just small beginnings, but we are seeing more and more Christians waking up to this. We are seeing churches begin to speak more on this, and so I'm absolutely with you. I'm believing and hoping for real change in our lifetime. But I think it's helpful to focus on with this the Rotherham and other places grooming gangs scandal. I do believe one of the greatest villains in the whole story is actually just fear of man. It's wanting to be seen as part of the respectable um, elite or mainstream culture of the day. Don't say the wrong things. Don't stir up trouble. Don't call it out. You don't want to be seen as far right. And I do fear that in the church, the very same villain really is what's holding us back. As you said in Scripture, we're warned, aren't we, that we will face trouble. People will falsely say all kinds of things against us, but Jesus says we're blessed if that happens. And there are so many warnings against the fear of man, against trying to please men, against desiring the praise of men. And yet, so often, that is what's holding us back um, from speaking the truth. Not just in issues like this grooming gang thing, but the the industrial scale slaughter of innocent children in the womb. We're still so silent, and of course, as Bonhoeffer said, um, silence is not neutral. Not not to act is to act, and so we do
Mm.
need to hear our part to play here. Um, I wonder if I might just um, move on to one final thing with you, Lois. While I've got you, I heard this. I could be 2 or 3 years ago now. I think you were at NatCon speaking on. Um, I don't remember the title, but it was about the importance of Christ as the foundation for conservatism, and Christless conservatism. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I can't remember the exact phraseology, but the import was, you know, conservatism without Christ is like a building without a foundation or something like that.
Yeah.
Can you just give us a little bit? Is that still your view, and what do you mean by that? Um, and what does that mean for how we advocate for justice in society? Does it mean we have to, in your view, lead with the gospel and start from sort of top down theology? Is there room for common grace, common ground, appealing to people's empathy and basic conscience? Just talk to us a little bit about that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. I think that speech came out of a frustration with the Tory party, the Conservative Party, who for 14 years were claiming the name Conservative, but really had very little to say for it. Under them, we saw pills by post come in to abortion clinics. We saw the destruction of marriage through no fault divorce. Family breakdown run rife across the country. People arrested for praying near abortion facilities. There was almost nothing conservative that they could have said that they achieved in those 14 years, maybe one or two minor things. And so I was frustrated because I think it was because they had no kind of vision. And I think
Mm,
um, a right without Christ, I mean, you can profess to certain values, you can say that you respect human rights, but what does that really mean if you
mm,
don't have an underlying foundation, a worldview in which you understand politics there? And so, understanding why it's important to care for the most vulnerable citizens, understanding why free speech is important because of the right to debate and to speak about faith, understanding why nobody should be arrested for their thoughts, even if they are, goodness me, pro-life. If you don't have an understanding, a kind of foundational principle of what a society should look like, there's not these principles will wash away as soon as the storm
mm,
comes, as soon as a
mm,
challenge comes from a liberal worldview.
mm,
And that's really what happened to the Tories, in my view. They had nothing to stand on because they didn't have a basis of faith. And I think,
mm,
honestly, a right without Christ is just as dangerous as a left without Christ.
mm,
So we see, the word far right is far too often used. It's called kind of a joke term, but there is a far right, and it's a far right that does hate women and thinks that it's led by men like Andrew Tate and others who are
mm,
really damaging to the idea that every person has a human dignity, and that we should strive for a world where men and women get on, are able to flourish in their own capacities and together in unions. And yeah. having a right without Christ is no interest to me, and it doesn't advance something for human flourishing. So I do believe that the basis for our vision has to be grounded in Christianity. That doesn't mean I think that we should talk about nothing else, or that we shouldn't be winsome in our arguments and put forward cases that right now people are able to understand. I kind of think of it as being an iceberg. An ice when you have an iceberg in the water, you see a tip, or it can be, you can see more of it or less of it, but there's this kind of bulk underneath. And I think we need that kind of foundational bulk
Mm.
as to why we think what we think. We need to kind of think through a Christian worldview, a principled look about how we want society to look. But once we're giving our arguments in different contexts, people can digest different levels of the iceberg being on show. I hope that kind of helps a little bit with where my understanding is. I think we always have to have that kind of foundational principle in our minds, but we can communicate based on the context and the situation, just as Jesus did. When he was preaching,
Mm.
when he was speaking to Jews, he would speak using things that they would understand, they would relate to. When he speak to Gentiles, something else. When he was speaking to kind of academics and priests, it would be something else again. And then shepherds who would use stories about sheep. Go figure. I think we can take on that mantle and communicate like that.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. So we need to have our own worldview clearly grounded. We need to know why we believe what we believe. Otherwise, we'll end up believing anything. But we still, seek to reach people in terms that they can understand. That's really helpful. The iceberg image, and certainly that's how we try to go about things in our work. We appeal to people. We show the humanity of the unborn child through pictures, and we use Socratic questioning, and we want to reason with people. As one Scott Klusendorf, I think it was, put it, you don't have to be a Christian to believe that killing toddlers is wrong.
Mm,
Now, you might need to be a Christian to know why it's wrong, but you
right.
clearly don't have to be a Christian to know it's wrong, to believe, to stand
Yeah.
on that. And from there, you don't have to be a Christian to believe it's wrong to kill unborn children. You just need
Right.
the science and some basic logic to see it's exactly the same. So yeah, I think I'm more or less on the same lines as you. We need to have our own foundations clear, but there are these common grace avenues for
Yeah.
reaching our society, which are and in large part it's the God-given conscience that is universal. That is a common grace that we can work with, but
Yeah.
whilst advocating for a more thoroughgoing,
Yeah.
rooted
Yeah. And I
approach.
think when people kind of realize what their conscience is telling them, often it does lead to a kind of realization about Christianity. I was speaking the other day, we were talking about Bonnie Blue and these porn stars who were going out and saying that they've slept with hundreds or thousands of men. And ultimately, most of us in society think, oh, that's
Yeah,
awful.
yeah,
But most of them would be challenged as to articulate why. Because we live in
yeah,
a society where we say, my body, my choice, love is love, whatever she wants to do. She's an empowered woman. But if she had given 100 hugs or 100 high fives, we wouldn't mind. But because we just suddenly have this like conscience triggered and like, oh,
yeah.
there's something wrong there. And I think even that can kind of profess the truth of the gospel, profess the truth of God, that we are inbuilt with these instinctive values. And if people can unpack why they are rejecting something or why they feel uncomfortable about something, often it leads back to that source of truth, which can be really helpful.
Yeah, 100%. It's so I keep saying 100% today. I'm sorry I've battered you with the term
100%
100%.
faithful. Have you been watching the traitors?
So Romans 1, isn't it? It's Romans 1, the conscience now justifies, now condemns. Is that also Romans 2, perhaps a bit into there,
Mm,
but it's yeah, we do have the knowledge of God. Everyone actually deep down knows about God. He's made himself clear in creation. We know there's a right, we know there's a wrong. We suppress that truth, but it's still there. And I think it's a real contact point for not only social reform or activism, whatever we want to call this, but also evangelism. People do have the knowledge of God. It's just suppressed. And I think we could do well to engage more with that. Lois, I'm really grateful for your time today. We'll need to wrap it up there. Do jump in if you've got any final things you want to say to people. In particular, how can they um, follow you or your work? What can they do to help in these causes? That sort of thing. Do you want to just throw something in there before I close?
sure. Yeah. Well, do find me on Twitter. I'm at Lois McLatch. Hope you'll be able to find me. And if you're interested in the work I do kind of on free speech cases, upholding the right of everyone who's speaking out about the truth of the unborn and other fundamental truths, you can catch up with ADF International. ADFinternational.org is their website.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lois. Really appreciate your time and insights on this, covering everything from this horrible scandal in the north, secret abortions and the state of play in our law, and looking as well at multiculturalism, different ideologies, and the importance of grounding our worldview in Christ. Thanks for taking us through all that, and really appreciate
No, thank
the
you.
work you do, and God bless you in the work you're doing, and lift up your voice, and yeah, continue to anoint your lips with grace in the places He's put you. Thanks for the work you're doing, and thanks everyone for listening today. Please do, as ever, like, share, comment, and all that kind of stuff. In particular, share this with your pastor if he's not already listening. And thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.